Um, Hopefully you are all back and connected up here. Um, we're going to talk for a few minutes about zoning. Elizabeth, thanks for rejoining here. I lost you, and that looks like you came right back. So um, we're going to talk about zoning. I'm going to spend some time tonight talking about zoning and building codes to try to set the stage for us diving into construction documents. So what is zoning? Zoning is actually the process where a governmental entity divides land in that entity. The Village of River Grove, the Village of Oak Park, where I live, uh, City of Chicago, City of Cicero, right? All those jurisdictions divide their land up into different areas and deem them to be for residential use, commercial use, or industrial use, right? They say the things that you can and can't do on each of those types of property. And then each of those types is regulated as to the size of the building that's permitted and the type of work, type of activity that can go on and in each of those areas. And we'll see why we do that. Again, zoning is not something new. People living in towns and cities have been doing it, traced back to antiquity a couple thousand years ago, right? We had ancient cities that were set up with walls, right? And we put all the undesirable things outside the city walls. Things that were noisy or smelled bad, we put outside the city walls. We probably put the poorest people outside the city walls, right? We still unfortunately do things like that today, right? And then inside the walls were the civic and religious spaces, and inside the walls were where people normally live. So we as humans have been, or we as organizers of towns and cities have been dividing up land uses for quite some time, right? So in the last century or so, we've been doing that in modern cities, right? Having overcrowded cities and pollution and squalor, things that you may have read about if you read a history of Chicago, right? Led local officials to consider separating uses from one another, right? Separate the homes from the shops, from the industries. So in the late 19th century, a little over 100 years ago, was when this started being done. So why do we have zoning? The primary reason we have zoning is the second bullet there, is to segregate uses that are thought to be incompatible. Again, if you own a house, you don't want a factory next to your house. You ideally want to have your house in a neighborhood that has other similar uses. So the idea of zoning is to separate uses and try to keep undesirable things away from residential areas. And zoning also determines what can be built and what not, what can and cannot be built on a certain parcel. Dictates the size of the house or type of house that could be built on a lot, right? It may have things to do with the driveways and the kitchens and the bathrooms. Villages are really trying to maintain the character of their community to prevent sprawl and overdevelopment. That's why they do these things. And in some cases may use zoning as a way of attracting new industry, right? They take a partial and they zone it as commercial industrial, and then hopefully they will attract people to come to their community. So jurisdictions, when I say jurisdiction, I mean a town or a village or a city, right? Again, You'll see a lot of things for me that say Oak Park because I live in the village of Oak Park. So the jurisdiction, the village that I live in has a zoning map, and they typical in that zoning map, and I'll try to blow it up a little bit here on the next slide. They typically have letter designations: R for residential, C for commercial, I for industrial, that designate what's allowable in a certain area. And then those letters are typically paired with a number that gives more detail as to what's allowable or permissible in a certain area. And again, your town or your village or your city is going to have something like this. So any of us that live in the area immediately surrounding Triton College, if you happen to live out in the country someplace, you may not have this, but generally speaking, all the jurisdictions, all the towns and cities and villages around Triton College are going to have something like this. Right, again, I tried to blow it up a little bit here. Again, the map will have each parcel of property and have a legend or a color code associated with it. R1, R2, R3, R3.5, R4, R5, that talks about what's permitted in a certain parcel. This happens to be where I live in Southeast Oak Park, just south of the Eisenhower Expressway, not too far off of Austin, right? So in my piece of Oak Park, you know, my area is sliced up into fairly narrow lots, 25 and 37.5 foot lots where we all live in bungalows. So so that's what my area looks like on a zoning map. And then you see commercial strips. This is Roosevelt Road and Austin Boulevard and Harrison Street in Oak Park. Again, you see kind of map-wise the separation between commercial and residential uses. No industrial areas that are in Oak Park that I'm aware of. And again, each of those areas on the zoning map will correspond to this letter and number designation that provides more detail about what's can and can't be built in this particular area. Again, why are we learning about this? Well, we're learning about this because what you can actually design or build on a parcel is going to depend on both the zoning and building codes, which we'll talk about. So again, the zoning map will dictate the minimum size of the lot, the minimum lot width, the maximum building height, and how much of the lot that building can cover. Hi, Nicole, if you're just joining, I think you may have emailed me saying that you were going to be running late tonight, so I'm glad that you finally made it.
Yes. Hello.
Hi. We're just getting into talking about zoning.
Oh,
So,
right. Thank you.
again, as you saw in the zoning map there, the zoning will dictate minimum lot sizes. It'll dictate what are called setbacks, you know, how far the building has to be set back or removed from the front and side and rear property lines. Floor area ratio is, in essence, the floor area of the building divided by the total size of the lot. Again, here's another example. I actually use this example. In the fall, I normally teach ARC 110, which is Sustainability 1. So in that class, we talk about density and development and preventing sprawl. So so I use the zoning map for Wheaton, which is a city that's a little further out from Oak Park to show that out in Wheaton, generally speaking, minimum lot sizes are a lot larger and lot widths are a lot greater. So obviously Wheaton is a city that has a lot lower density of residences than Oak Park does. And again, that didn't just happen. That happened because the folks in Wheaton and the folks in Oak Park planned it out that way. Excuse me. Okay. One other thing that zoning is often used for is maintaining the historic character of a community. Again, in Oak Park, where I live, we do have some historic districts. So if you happen to have a house in a historic district in Oak Park, there are going to be limitations on what the village allows you to do in terms of demolition or changing the appearance of your property, right? There may be some specific approvals required if you're in a historic area. I have some slides here of right, and this is Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, right? This would be a historic village that obviously has zoning that regulates the type and the character of the homes in Williamsburg. I think when I do my slides again here, I'll take some pictures of the historic district in Oak Park, and you'll also see what that looks like. So again, if you want to build something that does not conform to the zoning in your city, you can't just go ahead and build a house that's larger than what the zoning allows or closer to the lot line than the setbacks, right? You don't get to do that because someone from the village will find you and stop work on your project. So if you want to do something that doesn't conform to the zoning, if you want to put up a bigger or a taller house or a taller building, most jurisdictions have some kind of process that allows you to appeal to the village, to the jurisdiction, to put something up that's bigger or taller or larger than what zoning allows. In Oak Park, there's been a bit of a controversy because the village board has approved a number of high-rise buildings in downtown Oak Park and some development along Madison and Oak Park that didn't necessarily conform to zoning. So some of the residents, especially folks like Francis and I, who are concerned about the character of our community, we're not happy with some of the decisions that the village has made. But generally speaking, you as the property owner have the right to appeal to your village, your jurisdiction, for a change or a variance to the zoning of your parcel of land. And again, generally, things may work differently from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but generally speaking, the jurisdiction, the town or village will post notices and say, hey, we're going to have a public hearing, and anyone who's interested can come and talk about whether Jose, who lives at 1121 Main Street, gets to put a big addition on his house that's not in conformance with the zoning. So all of Jose's neighbors, if they're so inclined, can go to the public hearing and say, boy, I don't think Jose should be able to build that big house on this parcel because Jose's new house will be too big and out of character for the rest of the homes in this community. And then the zoning board or the people in the village will make a decision as to whether the zoning variance that Jose is seeking will be granted or not. So again, I talk about, we're going to see plans and specifications for lots of different building types. But again, at the root of it all is a zoning ordinance that says what you actually can or can't build in a certain parcel of land. I Tonight, as I will every night, I'm making a recording of my lectures. So I will post recordings of lectures onto Blackboard in case either A, you don't make it to class, or B, you want to go back and look at something that we talked about. So any questions about zoning?
So, where would I be able to look up like different zoning maps?
I can't tell who was asking the question, but you would go to either go to your city hall or your village hall. They should have those maps available. Also, most towns and cities have this information on their website as well. Again, the maps that I put up for Oak Park, I went to the Village of Oak Park website, and like any other website, you got to poke around a little bit to find what you're looking for. But they did have a PDF of the zoning map for Oak Park, and I did the same thing for I don't know if it's a village or the city of Wheaton. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think. I know I get a little thing all the time about my parcel, at assessment time and at tax time, and I have to think. I don't believe that the zoning on my parcel of land is shown in my assessment or my stuff related to my tax. But again, your village or your town or your city will have this information either at City Hall or on the website or both. Great, good question. Any other questions?
Yes, this is Ayana Swift. I'm going to I also live in Oak Park community, and I'm going to attend I don't think it's a zoning meeting, but it's some kind of meeting because they're proposing to put a new building within 300 feet of my home. So I'm looking forward to that on February the 4th, I think.
Yes. Again, I would expect that um, at that site or that property, there should be a public notice posted. I think the Village of Oak Park actually puts a little easel up, a little metal easel that looks like a traffic sign, and they put a zoning notice on it. So, I think that's the process that you'll be participating in. And yes, you have the right to say what you think about your neighbor's plans. Again, the zoning board may or may not listen to, well, they will hopefully listen to you. They may or may not vote in conformance to what you want them to do, but you certainly, as a member of the public, have a chance to voice your concerns about what your neighbors are doing with your property, with their property. Great. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, yeah, I was reading one information that you posted on the screen. It's something about why Houston had no zoning map or area, something like that.
Yeah, I had a few slides back. Yes, I think
Yeah, exactly, right there.
Houston has no zoning, right? There are, not every city has this sort of zoning, and some cities are more free-form than what they allow than others. To the best of my knowledge, the city of Houston and the surrounding communities don't really have zoning, so they essentially allow people to build whatever they want, wherever they want to build it.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
so I know I have a cousin who lives in Houston, and he happens to be part of, it's not a gated community, but I think he's part of a a private association that attempts to get around that by, regulating what happens in his little area, right? Because he doesn't want to build a house and then have somebody open up an adult bookstore next to his house, right? That's not what you want as a homeowner. If you build a house, you ideally want to have somebody the person who owns a lot next to you build a house that is similar in character to your house, right? So that's the whole reason for zoning.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Welcome. And again, I was using you as an example before, and I think Ayana had the same thing, right? Where someone in Ayana's neighborhood, I'm assuming, is looking for some kind of zoning variance. So Ayana gets to go and voice her concerns about what her neighbor is trying to do. Great. Okay. We're going to switch topics here, and we're going to talk about building codes. And I didn't stop and start the recording, so it looks like you get one long recording here. I have to remind myself how to do that. I have to, between Blackboard and YouTube, I turn my lectures into YouTube videos. So, okay, so we just talked about zoning, and now we're going to talk about a related topic, which is building codes. So again, these are just like zoning is a set of rules about what you can and can't build on a certain parcel. Building codes are a set of rules as well that get into more detail about what zoning is about, what you can build. Building codes will be about how you have to build it. Right, so again, the notion of people regulating what can be built goes back a long time. Here's Hammurabi here, 2,000 or so years ago. If a builder build a house for someone, even though he has not yet completed it, if then the walls seem toppling, the building must make the walls solid from his own means, right? So again, for a long time, we've been trying to regulate the way that people build their structures. So what is a building code? A building code is a series of ordinances or a series of laws that are enacted by a state or local government entity that establish minimum requirements that must be met in the construction and maintenance of buildings, right? A building code is the minimum that you must do, right? You can always build a better building, a higher quality building, than what the code mandates. You can put in more toilets than what the code mandates, etc. Whatever you want to do. But a building code sets a minimum requirement that you must meet when you're building a property. Right. So again, we as human beings, in grouping ourselves into towns and cities, we've had some form of building codes for a long time. Right. Our founding fathers, Washington and Jefferson, encouraged us to develop building codes. One of the things that really pushed the adoption of building codes were some of the fires and earthquakes that happened. Right. Certainly the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 encouraged changes to the building code, right? after the fire and after, you know, lots of major disasters, cities look at their building codes and say, hey, maybe we should think more about fireproof construction, right? Or how we protect buildings or make them stronger in the event of a flood or a fire or an earthquake, right? So that happened after the Chicago fire. I think the same thing happened in San Francisco after the earthquake there, both an earthquake and fire. Again, those sorts of natural disasters tend to spur improvements in building codes. Right, so basically building codes will happen generally at the local level, right? Building codes aren't something that the federal government does, generally not something that state governments do. It's something happens happens at the level of the local town and village. Certain things are exempt from building codes. Right, probably the biggest thing would be manufactured housing, trailers, and that sort of thing may not be subject to building codes.
But I'm sorry, Dan, excuse me. So do you mean like the prefabricated houses, or because you said
Yeah,
trailers,
I
but
was
like
actually thinking of a manufactured, like a house trailer. I don't believe a house trailer is subject to building codes. A house trailer might be subject to zoning, but I don't believe it's subject to building codes. Manufactured house, well, when I think of in this context, I'm thinking of let's say a trailer that you tow to a site and then you bolt that trailer down or tie that trailer down. That's what I'm thinking of as manufactured housing. That might be different from prefabricated. So again, these things all vary on a state and local basis. Again, in the state of Illinois, generally speaking, villages, towns and villages and jurisdictions can adopt building codes, but they certainly have to meet the requirements at the state level. And again, on a state by state basis, there you'll see that localities will adopt things to address the building codes to their local needs. And I'm sorry, I had to, A, I'm losing my voice, and B, I had to break my presentation up into a couple bits and pieces here to fit into Blackboard. So let me load up the next piece here. Hold on. So again, a building code is typically not a single piece of paper. It's basically a series of documents that cover all the different aspects of construction. You know, the gas piping, the plumbing, the electricity, the fire alarm, the structure, right? Building codes generally regulate all aspects of construction projects, structural design, sanitation, fire prevention, et cetera, right? Again, we're trying to set standards, minimum standards for how a building is built. Again, building codes are minimum requirements for a building for health, safety, and general welfare, right? Part of the reason for building codes is to protect you as a homeowner from your neighbor next door doing something dumb, right? Just like zoning protects you from your neighbor next door building a house that's too big or out of character. building codes also prevent your neighbor from building a lousy, shoddy addition on their house that's going to fall over and endanger your property. So again, we're construction professionals here. Everything we do is high quality, but we can't always control what our neighbors do, right? So again, buildings don't necessarily guarantee that we're going to build a high quality building, but they do ensure that buildings are reasonably safe. I certainly make this point all the time in my sustainability class, because we talk a lot about energy efficiency and high performance buildings. And I always say, you know, just meeting the building code is not enough. It's not enough if we want to make buildings that use a lot less energy. So we talk a lot about in my 110 class about going beyond what the building code stipulates. Right? Towns and cities have inspection mechanisms to inspect buildings for code compliance. What happens sometimes when building codes are not followed? Well, you have buildings that may be severely damaged in an earthquake. See, I think these are some structures from San Francisco and an earthquake that took place there, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, right? This is a better one. I think these are a couple of pictures of some high-rise construction in China. Again, the builder or the contractor cut some corners. Excuse me, cut some corners here, and the building toppled over. Sorry, I've been a little under the weather the last couple of weeks, so my voice is starting to get gravelly at the end of the class. Right. So this what happened when the contractor low bid the job to try to get the work and realized that he bid too low. Right. He had to cut some corners, he or she. And this was the result. Right. This is the other. Again, what I said before about building codes protecting you from your neighbors' shoddy construction practices, right? So part of building codes is not only for the health and safety of the homeowner, but for the protection of folks who live on adjacent properties. Our next door neighbors in Oak Park, they were putting up a porch a couple of years back, which I think was actually the guy who lives in the house and his father and his father-in-law were building a porch, and they were doing a pretty half-assed job of it. So a little birdie told the Village of Oak Park that people were doing work without a permit, and the village came and stopped the work on that project because they hadn't pulled a building permit. And I think they ended up hiring someone who built a much better porch than what the homeowners were going to be able to build themselves. Why do we have building codes? Let me play this clip from YouTube here. Hold on.
Este edificio se movió horrible, horrible, tronó horrible. Que se salgan, la pared se rompió, que se salgan, que se salgan, se va a caer. Dios mío, 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 Dios mío. La gente. Exacto, güey. Sí. No te necesito.
So building code, whoops, I gotta stop something here.
Here we go. My fellow Americans, 4 years ago,
I got too many screens open here. Anyways, you can look at that clip. I'll send that link out, but I'm guessing these are structures that this was from an earthquake in Mexico City, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago perhaps, but a lot of examples of buildings falling down, my guess because they weren't built, or they may not have been built according to code, right? Somebody cut some corners and you don't notice that the corners were cut until, right, something happens, right? In this case, an earthquake happens. Right, so when do building codes apply? When do we have to follow building codes? Generally speaking, if in the case of new construction, the entire building must be built with full compliance of local codes and ordinances. If you're making a major addition or renovation, that addition or renovation has to be built to the current codes. Generally speaking, it won't be forced to bring your entire house up or property up to code, but just the area that you are renovating. So in other words, let's say you're putting a new back porch on your house. Obviously, the back porch has to be built to the current code, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to bring the rest of the house up to code. Change in occupancy, right? If something is changed from, let's say, a commercial use to a residential use, that may trigger building codes. And sale of a building may trigger the need for codes as well. So how does all this stuff work? Well, the building codes that are used by most of the jurisdictions in our area are based on a model building code. So in other words, the village of Oak Park and the city of Berwyn and the city of Cicero, et cetera, each of those towns and cities doesn't have the wherewithal to figure all this stuff out by themselves. So there are organizations that we shall see that develop model building codes. Those model building codes are built and developed by a standards organization that's independent of the jurisdiction, the jurisdiction again being the town or village that's responsible for enacting the building code. So that local unit of government, so the village of Oak Park, can adopt that model building code and make it their own code. This saves the government, this saves the village of Oak Park from the expense and the trouble of having to develop their own codes. You know, most of the smaller units of government around us aren't going to have the expertise to do something like this. Right? Most towns and villages don't write their own building codes. They adopt something that comes from the ICC, or the International Code Council. These are now often called the I codes, right? So the predominant I codes are the International Building Code or the International Residential Code. So again, these model building codes are typically revised or updated on 3-year cycles, and the town or a village adopts that building code. And let me switch to the next slide here, hold on. Right, so in that building code, we have a clear scope. We try as best we can to have unambiguous language. We want to have language that's clear, such that the code enforcement people, the inspectors, can read and understand what's in the building code and can enforce it. Codes typically have specific enforceable requirements. You'll see the word shall a lot of times in the building code. Like, the plumbing to this particular fixture shall be a minimum of 3/4 inch. Or the drain piping shall be constructed of PVC of a specific wall thickness. And a code uses defined terms. We're not going to say may do this, we will say that you shall do this. Right? We're trying to make it, codes are trying to make it as clear as possible for everybody what the rules are. So again, local jurisdictions will typically formally adopt that building code. So as you'll see in a couple slides here, the Village of Oak Park at some point passed a law that said we are formally adopting the IRC 2008 as the building code for the Village of Oak Park. Local jurisdictions will often have amendments to those codes for specific local conditions and needs, specific building practices that may make sense in a location, specific materials and availability of materials, specifics in terms of labor rules and regulations, specifics for political considerations in that town or village or city. Certainly, as I talked about before, they'll have things related to historic zones. So again, a town or a city will adopt that model code, and they might put some amendments there. Right, so the International Building Code is a model code, again, developed by the International Code Council, and again, updated in 3-year cycles. So we have a picture here of IBC 2015. My guess is there's an IBC 2018 that's already out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your town or village is going to be following IBC 2015 or 2018. You have to go and look and see exactly which code that they've adopted. Government moves slowly, so units of government are probably a cycle or two behind in terms of what code version that they have adopted. But if you're building a commercial building and you're quite likely to be following the International Building Code. If you're building a home or a small multi-unit development, you're generally going to be following the International Residential Code. Right? As it says here, designers are responsible for making sure that all codes and addendum are applied for the community in which they are building. So any of you who are architects, if you're a designer, right, you have to know the rules of the code. However, if you're a contractor, you likely need to be familiar with these rules as well, right? You give a bid to a homeowner to do a kitchen renovation in their house. The homeowner that you've signed a contract with, they're going to expect you to know the codes and make sure that the work that you do conforms to the local requirements. I have a link here for which I'll put up on the website as well, for the electronic version of all these things. I would say normally if I'm when I'm doing my 110 class, we talk about building codes as well. Normally, if we're in the classroom, I say go look on the shelf in the studio next door, and you can see all these code documents and see what the codes look like. But obviously, I can't do that right now because we're teaching the class virtually. But we do have copies of all these various codes sitting on the shelf in the studio at Triton. But again, the electronic version, you see examples of all the different things, all the different parts of a building, wall coverings, roof assemblies, chimneys and fireplaces, heating and cooling equipment and appliances, exhaust systems, etc. Right? You see all the different parts of the structure that the code will reference. Passive radon gas controls, piping standards, etc., etc. Again, as an architect or designer, right, you have to be familiar with this because you need to follow these rules when you design the building. If you're a contractor or a carpenter, I think I heard a bunch of you say that you're interested in being carpenters, right, or plumbers or pipe fitters, right? The work that you do has to follow the rules as well. So it's incumbent upon you to understand the code, or someone in your firm to understand the code, right? Your superintendent, your foreman, right? Make sure foreman's going to make sure that you run the right size pipe, and foreman doesn't want you to screw up because then you've got to go back and tear that work out and do it again, which the foreman's not going to like. Again, so an example of something that is contained in the building code, there'll be a table that talks about the sizing and spacing of studs for a bearing wall. And if you read here, bearing walls shall be sheathed, blah, 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 bridging shall be installed, right? The code is trying to make it as clear as possible about what you have to do. Talked about the family of I codes, right? We looked at a picture of the International Building Code, the IBC, the IRC. There's an International Fire Code, International Energy Conservation Code, etc., etc. I'm looking at the clock here, and rather than me diving into another section, I am going to stop here and ask if people have any questions.
I have a quick question about the family of I codes. This is Nicole. So, can one assume that the International Building Code would also have, some things in it related to fire protections, for example, or do you really need to be familiar with all of these codes as you're working, either in design or in the actual construction of the structure?
Sure. The codes are all meant to fit together. I would say that the IRC, or the International Residential Code, is going to be, generally speaking, a standalone document, right? Because building a house is less complicated than, say, building the Sears Tower. I would have to go back and look at the IBC, or the International Building Code. It's probably going to reference certainly the plumbing code and the mechanical code. So as you get into more complex structures, I think the codes will get bigger and more complicated. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but yes, I would expect that if you're building a house, the fire protection or the fire alarm requirements or that sort of thing, smoke alarm requirements will be contained within the IRC. If you're building a high-rise building or something that's bigger and more complicated, I'm guessing you'll have to refer to both the IBC and the IFC and related documents. Again, if you're let's say you're an architect designing a complex structure like a high-rise, you're generally going to have people on your design team who have expertise in those particular areas that will make sure that, the requirements for the fire, your electrical engineer will make sure that the fire alarm system that you design meets the requirements of the International Fire Code. Ditto for your mechanical engineer and your plumbing designer. So you don't necessarily have to know all those things that are contained in all those books if you're an architect. Does that answer your question, Nicole?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. Any other questions, folks?
I have a question. I'm looking at the syllabus, and when do you recommend we do the homework and the reading assignments by?
That's a very good question. I set stuff up in week by week increments, so I would certainly want you to do the work for week number 1. Doing during this week and maybe over the weekend. The way that I have things structured. Again, I have a quiz that I'm going to try to give on, first thing on the Tuesday class that covers the material from the previous week. So hopefully you do your week number 1 work during week number 1, and you're prepared for Tuesday's class. So I would say don't get, keep up with your work and try not to get behind, because I'm going to be quizzing you on last week's work on each Tuesday class.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Again, good question. Anything else, folks? Okay, well,